All right, everybody, so let's get started here. We don't have a ton of attendees today for this webinar, so it's not going to be incredibly long. I'm going to try to fit as much stuff into it as I can. If you guys have any questions, feel free to hit up the Q&A dialogue. Just to let you guys know, I don't have anyone writing along with me in the webinar for the Q&A, so I'll try to answer as many questions as I can throughout the webinar. I'll try to get to each one. And if you can, try to make it pertinent to the video. You know, if you see something on there that sparks a question, feel free to put in, a question or a comment in that Q&A, and I'll try to get to those throughout the webinar. So to get started here, my name is Dylan. I'm sure if you guys have attended a webinar before, you've heard me or Mo talk. And I'm the other software and video educator here at ON1. And a little bit about me, I went to college in Montana, and as soon as I graduated, I started shooting real estate photography full-time for about 2.5 years. And so I know not a whole lot about real estate photography, but I've been doing it for a while, enough to let you guys in on some secrets and how to shoot. So to get started, we're just going to kind of go over a few different ways that you can compose for your interior shots and exterior shots, a few different ways that you can use different angles and different points of view within a room to sort of maximize how that room feels, different marketable features such as windows and things you should avoid, things you should add into a shot. And then we'll get into how to edit. I'll show a few different single exposure edits that you can do. HDR is pretty easy when you're shooting real estate, but if you are just wanting to shoot RAW, or you could even shoot JPEG and just do it with a single exposure, you can. So I'll show you guys a little bit on how to do that as well. And then I'll show you guys a few different gear recommendations that I would recommend if you're kind of just starting out and you want to not spend a whole lot of money, but you kind of want to get a good bang for your buck. And then we'll go over how to do, just kind of how to merge some stuff into HDR, and then we should be good to go. So if you guys do have any questions, feel free to hit up that Q&A again, and let's get started here. So the first photo we'll start out with this photo here, and it's basically an empty lobby into a house. It's vacant. There's nothing going on really too much here, and this is kind of why I wanted to start this out, is because you can have great real estate photos without having anything in the shot. And I think this photo kind of speaks for itself in the sense that there's all these beautiful lines in here, and you have a window right here, and then you can see the chandelier. So whenever I'm composing for real estate, I try to think about what are the most marketable features in the room. And for this, I think a lot of the marketable features are shown. You can see here that we have this nice flooring right here. We have this great stairway leading up, and there's a chandelier. You can see part of the chandelier in the dining room area, which are great marketable features. People love to see lighting. People love to see, vintage lighting like chandeliers and things like that. And you also have a window, which comes to no surprise for you guys, that windows are one of the most marketable features in any home ever. People love windows because you have natural light, which people tend to love, and also you can see outside, and if there's views, you can't beat having a window. So I only shot this photo with a single exposure because the great thing about ON1 Photo RAW is you can always go back, and since the shadow slider is so incredibly powerful, it's pretty easy to sort of dim down the window and then pull up all the darker areas in the shot. For example, whenever you're shooting real estate, so we'll just take this photo into develop. Whenever you're shooting real estate, most of the time you're going to have like a little bit of a blown out window. And there's not a whole lot of blowing out going on in this window because it was shot on a pretty overcast, gloomy day. So if you do shoot one single exposure, an easy way to really kind of combat this blown out window here is to just pull back on the exposure slider if it's a little blown out for you. And then you can just go down to your shadow slider and just crank them up. And you'll see already that that's bringing out a lot of those darker areas in my photo. And so I've only done that in, two sliders, the exposure slider and the shadow slider. So you'll see that if I hit the \key on my keyboard, it's like a night and day difference. And the thing you want to keep in mind is whenever you're, if you're shooting a single exposure, if you do pull up on the shadow slider a ton, then you'll kind of get a little bit of noise because it's trying to really pull out those dark areas in your interior, and you can kind of get a little bit of noise in here. Well, the good thing about Photo RAW is that you can go down here to your details, and if you do have any noise, you can use any of these preset styles to sort of take the noise out. I'm not a huge fan of using denoising because I feel like most of the time people can't really notice, especially if you're just sending them to like a realtor. I would say though, if you're shooting it commercially and you're shooting it for, you know, it's a bigger job than just like a everyday realtor, I would probably shoot raw just so that you do have all those details and you can go back and pull them out. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because we're actually already editing this photo, but one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind whenever you're shooting real estate is that the lines in your photo are going to be probably the biggest thing that you can be aware of. And by lines, I mean vertical lines, like these vertical lines here that are basically just the sides of walls. Those need to be incredibly straight. So whenever you're shooting real estate, it's very important that you keep all of your vertical lines incredibly straight, because it's kind of hard to emulate straight lines in post-production. So the biggest thing to do whenever you're shooting is to beforehand either make sure your camera's level or you have a hot shoe level on your camera, whatever it needs to be. I think you can actually go into, in most cameras nowadays, you can just set a level on there and you can look in there and it'll show you if your camera's level or not. So that's incredibly key because it's really hard to straighten them after the fact. So if you go into this crop here and you'll see that these lines they're pretty straight. I mean, they're not incredibly straight. They could be a little bit straighter, but look how terrible it looks if they're a little bit crooked. I mean, it's just awful. So, I mean, really very important to keep all of your verticals straight in your photo, or else it'll look a little wonky and not very appealing. The second line that you really need to consider whenever you're shooting is the lines that are leading into the subjects, or the lines that are sort of bringing the viewer's eye around your scene. So, for example, this photo is a great example of that because we have these great lines in the flooring that are kind of bringing our eyes into the stairway. It's leading my eyes up this stairway. The stairs are taking my eyes up here, and then I have the chandelier. But they're also taking me to these little nooks and crannies in here that are great marketable features, because people see those and they're like, oh, people spent time on these, you know, building this place, and people spent time adding these features to make it a great home. So you really want lines kind of leading people into your scene and, you know, leading the viewer's eyes around the room so that they can get a nice feel for what that room is like. If you crop this, so say you crop this photo, and we'll crop it until we don't have any of those lines. There's not much. I mean, you have this where it's kind of leading your eyes up here, but it doesn't really represent that whole, you know, space as its entirety, and you kind of get this little feeling that there's a lot more involved into this picture. Another great thing that you need to keep, you don't need to keep in mind, another great thing that you should keep in mind whenever you're shooting real estate is to keep in mind that you're also using lines, other lines other than the lines on the floor, to keep viewers enticed into your photo. For example, you see this third wall over here. It has a line leading in to the scene over here. So if we crop this out, if we crop this third wall out, it almost feels like we're making this the entire subject, whereas I feel like we could make this entire area over here the subject and make it a lot more enticing for the viewer. So a great way to keep viewers enticed and to keep sort of a sense of space within your photo is to add a third wall. And I know that not all times shooting real estate you can have a third wall, especially if it's pretty crammed up and there's not a whole lot of room in the room. But if you do have the opportunity to shoot with a third wall, it's incredibly satisfying because it allows the viewer to see where that sort of space ends and begins, and it kind of gives them an idea of where things are located in the room. So I really like third walls for the sense that they give a sense of space, but also because they allow viewers to, it kind of leads viewers' eyes around the area, sort of like leading lines would. So those are a few things to keep in mind: leading lines, keeping your vertical straight, and then having a third wall. Another great thing to keep in mind whenever you're shooting is to think about composition. So compositionally, if you're shooting a room, say you're shooting a room like this, for example, and if you tilted the camera a little bit further that way to the left rather than to the right, you would have this weird sort of, we'll just do a 16:9. to give you an idea. It wouldn't look as great because you wouldn't have, you know, any of these other areas so that for the viewer to look at, and it wouldn't give a sense of space at all. So we'll crop this out of here. So whenever you're thinking of composition, you really want to frame it how you would frame any other photo. So you wouldn't probably frame it to where, you know, you leave that huge chunk area right there in there. I mean, I would leave a little bit maybe just so that you can see where that room goes, but I mean, I definitely wouldn't leave this entire chandelier, you know, halfway cut off. So you want to think about, I guess whenever I'm thinking about composition, I always like to think about what would it look like in a frame. So for this, to me, how I would crop this is I would take out that half of that chandelier, I'd pull this crop in, and then if I hit enter here and I zoom in, I see that there's a little bit of that other, I guess, detail on the wall that's kind of cut off there. If you crop something and there's a little bit of area left on there that you know should be straight, it's kind of distracting. And I know you probably wouldn't notice that unless I zoomed into that. But a good way to do it is just to crop right up against another vertical line. And you could either crop it that way or you could crop it in, but I would not leave, you know, a bunch hanging out. See how that looks much better than it did, whereas if I just went over here and left that area kind of open. So it's just tiny little things that you'll learn whenever you're shooting that just make the photo a little bit better. We'll go to a different photo that might be a bad example for that one. Okay, this will be a great example because it always happens often in bedrooms. So we'll go in here and we'll do the same thing we did before with that other real estate picture. We'll just go to our tone and color and we'll pull up on the exposure maybe a little or pull down on it. And then we'll just boost our shadows a ton. So now we have like a sort of simply exposed shot. If I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, and you'll notice if I crop this, and say I crop it to where I have half the lamp right there, it looks a little, the framing is off and the composition is off because we have this half of lamp sitting right there, and it's a little distracting because it's like, you know, is there another piece to the lamp or is this where the wall ends? So whenever I'm cropping, I always just like to use vertical lines, and you could probably just do it right, you know, right by that curtain right there. Picture frames are a great thing to crop or to use as framing. You could probably use this picture frame right there, but I always like to keep it inside. So if this picture frame was right here, you could crop it to where it's right, you know, where it's inside the frame, but we're just going to use this curtain here. We'll go to a different example. Oh, this will be a good example. So you'll see right there that that thing is obviously incredibly distracting because it's just a huge chunk of wood, and we'll just pull up on the shadows here. There we go. So we have this huge chunk of wood right here, and if we crop inside of it, it immediately makes it a better picture because you have this large distracting thing that's hanging to the left side of your frame that it kind of keeps the viewer's eye over there, whereas if you cropped it, it allows for the viewer to kind of lead around and then come back. And then, you know, it kind of keeps the viewer enticed into the image. So those are just a few things, I guess, to think about compositionally when you're shooting. Leading lines is a huge one. So you'll see in this picture we have these leading lines here that are bringing the viewer into this window area. You have this leading line from the couch taking the viewer over to this kitchen. You have the third wall here so you know where that room ends. We have marketable features. We have a fireplace. We have the hardwood flooring. We have the kitchen. And we also have windows. So there's, you know, a big three right there that you've kind of already knocked out in one frame simply by just putting your camera in a corner and just shooting with these leading lines here. So another big thing that people like to think of, or that people think is a huge thing in real estate, is shooting symmetrical. And shooting symmetrical is awesome, but most of the time rooms don't really need symmetrical shots, and oftentimes they almost kind of make the room seem a little bit smaller. But I do, there's obviously sometimes when you do need to shoot symmetrical shots, and I have one here. And a huge thing to keep in mind when you're shooting symmetrical shots is to make sure that your camera is literally in the middle of the room. So try to, I didn't keep this, we'll go into develop here, but if you'll notice this crop, I didn't really keep the lines as straight as I could have. Lucky for me, the camera was level all around, and I can go in and I can kind of straighten it up here. But you'll notice here that down at the bottom, in the middle of the frame, there's the line that's the middle of the room, and you'll see that my camera was right in front of that. So if you are going to shoot symmetrical, it's incredibly important that you keep your camera in the middle, as close as the middle as you can, so that you do get this nice symmetry. Because if it's a little bit off, it can kind of feel wonky, and it almost looks like you're using an angled shot when you're looking for symmetrical. So, and a good thing about symmetrical shots is to tighten the frame. So you'll notice that this symmetrical shot is pretty wide. I think I shot it with like a 10 millimeter. Yeah, 10 millimeter. So I'm actually just going to pull in the crop. And again, like we were saying with the framing, is just to create, make sure that you're not cutting off a bunch of stuff. And that looks good right there. And the reason we can get away with cutting these handles off right here is because that's incredibly dark down there, and no one's going to even notice. So it's not going to be distracting because there's not going to be any lines. So we'll make sure that this top crop little bar right here is in the middle of the frame, as well as this crop bar there. We'll just straighten those lines out. And boom, now we have a nice symmetrical shot that kind of allows us to see all of the areas in the room without being at an angle. And the great thing about symmetrical shots, especially in bathrooms, is that they have these great leading lines that kind of lead your eye into the subject. So we'll do the same thing we've done before. And for this photo, I'm actually going to hold down the J key. So the J key is going to show me my true white and true black, and the red is going to be showing me all of my true white without any detail. So this is kind of like this is basically how I like to start out if I'm shooting, or if I'm editing sort of any real estate photo. I'll hold down my J key, especially if it's a single exposure, because most of the time that window is going to be kind of blown out. And I'll just pull back on the exposure. So holding down the J key, I'll pull back on the exposure to kind of bring out, kind of remove some of those true white areas without any detail. And then I'll just pull up again on the shadow slider. And it'll bring out all of those dark tones from my photo. And you can kind of even tweak it a little bit more if you wanted to pull back a little bit more on the exposure. Probably going to leave it how it is. And then another great thing to add if you're editing real estate photos is you want contrast without contrast. And it's kind of weird to say it like that, but you want contrast without bringing in a ton of dark areas, because you want to be able to see all of this stuff going on in here. And I'll show you a few different ways that you can kind of bring out darker tones if they didn't come out with the shadows. But you'll notice that if I turn this contrast super high, too much contrast looks really ugly in real estate because you want to see a lot of the nooks and crannies in there. So we'll keep the contrast, low, and then we'll pull back just a hair, just to give our photo a little bit of true black. I'm talking like that much, -3, just so there's a little bit of contrast, enough to give it some life and give it some pop and give it some detail. And then a huge thing, you can either add structure in tone and color, or you can go into effects and add, dynamic contrast, or you can add like an HDR look. I'll show you the 3 different ways to do it. So usually if I'm just kind of editing a photo pretty quickly, I'll just go in here and I'll just add some structure. And you'll notice that really brings in a lot of detail into the photo. But you'll notice that once you add structure, you're bringing in more contrast. So if I hold down my J key and I pull back on the structure slider, you'll see that it's bringing in a lot more true black. So if you don't want that, you can pull back or you pull up on your structure slider to give as much structure as you want. And then you can just simply pull back on your blacks. It's actually, the photo's looking a little crooked on these lines here. And that probably was my fault because I wasn't level at first. So if we just crop it like that, and then just hit the enter key, that looks a lot better like that. So Another thing too, especially if you're dealing with adding detail, is if you don't want to use structure, which is completely fine, and you head into effects to add, let's say dynamic contrast. A great thing about dynamic contrast is you can mess with the tone of it. So you can mess with the shadows and the whites and the blacks, and then you can add it selectively. So if you wanted to just kind of spruce up these areas in the tub and on the cabinets here, you could simply add, I just like to add surreal at first, and then I'll just go to invert. I'll hold down Shift and X to switch my mode to paint in, and then I can just simply paint in that dynamic contrast. And you'll see that already, here we can pull up on the shadows a lot more too. There we go. So now you can see that's really pulling out a lot of that shadow detail in the photo and kind of bringing those nice areas that are a little darker to life. So that's probably an advantage of using dynamic contrast compared to structure, is that you can selectively add it to whatever areas on there that you'd like. I tend to use structure if I'm just I know that the photo's well exposed. If it's an HDR shot, which we'll edit a couple HDR shots in a second, but if it's an HDR shot, you really don't have to mess too much with the shadows or the tonality. It's kind of all just about kind of tweaking the sharpness and adding in the details. So, this is a great way if you have one single exposure to add in, a lot of great detail and bringing out some of the darker tones in your photo without actually having to shoot HDR. Because if you had a raw photo, this is a JPEG photo, and you can see that we're already, we're applying a lot of selective edits and bringing out a lot of those darker colors, and there's only a little bit of noise. I mean, there's quite a bit of noise in the tub, but you can go back and you can fix that. So, this is a JPEG photo, and we're already making it look like a really great photograph for an interior of a home, and it's a single shot. So you don't need HDR. I would recommend starting out with HDR if you do, want to pursue something in real estate photography, just because it allows you to, you have all those auto exposure brackets that you can merge together, but then you can also go back and just take, whatever exposure bracket you want and then edit that. So, yeah. And then also, if you do have something like this, like a little bit of a lens flare, you can always take like a retouch brush. I don't know how well it's going to do. Oops. We'll just clone stamp it. Clone stamp tool is like your best friend if you're trying to make stuff away. That might be a tough one. We'll leave that one because I don't want to ruin that window side, and then people will get it if you have a lens flare right there. I don't want to go into too much detail about the retouching stuff just because I want to show you guys a lot more about just like the actual shooting of the real estate. So sorry if you were expecting me to retouch today, because I just want to show you guys a lot more about the real estate end of things. So, okay, so that's our symmetrical shot. That's a little bit about how to edit, a single exposure for real estate. Definitely think about your exposure and think about your sliders. Think about the shadows. The main thing, especially if you're shooting one single exposure, is, I've been saying it a bunch, but your windows are usually going to be blown out. So you're going to want to probably pull back on the exposure and then kind of increase the shadows. So now that we've gone over how to edit a single exposure for real estate, let's go over how to edit an HDR photo. And this is an HDR photo I merged together. If you want to merge HDR photos together inside of Photo RAW, simply click on however many exposure brackets you have and then just go to HDR. It's incredibly simple, pretty self-explanatory. I don't want to go into too much on how to do HDR, just simply because it's pretty basic and I know you guys got it. So try it out and I'm sure it'll work. So to edit an HDR exposure. So the biggest thing about editing HDR exposures or merged HDR exposures is that they're probably, all the tonalities are going to look great in them already. So you'll see in this photo here that there's not a whole lot of areas that need a ton of sprucing up, but it could be brought to life a little bit more. So the first thing I like to do whenever I'm editing HDR merges is I'll just go down to my midtones, my shadows, and my exposure. So those are kind of my three main ones, and then after that we'll kind of go back into like the blacks and the structure and your temperature and stuff. So usually just like to mess with the exposure first. You can even just kind of play with it and see. In a photo like this, where you'll look over here, and if you hold down your J key, you'll see that there's a little bit of blown out white, but there's not a ton. You know, if there's less than 10%, I wouldn't even say 10, if there's less than like 6% of your photo that's covered in true white with no detail, that's not a huge deal. If you do want to get rid of all that true white though, you can hold down your J key and then just pull back on the exposure, and now you can remove it. So now that you have that removed, now you can always go in and then just, like we were doing earlier, just pull up on the shadows a little bit. And you'll notice that in this one, once we pulled up on the shadows, it made it quite flat. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, bringing out those shadows kind of made it flat. So a great way to add contrast is to go into your black slider. And just like before, you don't want a whole lot of black or a whole lot of contrast, just simply because it, you know, makes the photo look a little bit grungy and dark, and most realtors don't want like a dark interior of a house. So you could hold down your J key again and just barely add. Actually, that's quite a bit of black. So you can add, you know, quite a bit of black, kind of depending on the photo, but you know, once you get it, now if we look at it, it's maintained all of that. So if we click this off, see that? I mean, that's just, I mean, it's really bringing in, you know, nice contrast, and makes the photo pop a little bit more, makes it seem a less flat. So to emphasize, again, whenever you're editing real estate photos, whether it's an HDR merged together photo or it's just a single exposure, keep in mind that your exposure slider, your shadow slider, your midtone slider, depending. So if I boosted this midtones up, it'd kind of bring a little bit of life into the photo. But depending on midtones, and then your black slider are kind of going to be your key elements to editing, because they kind of deal strongly with the darker areas in your photo, which there's going to be if you have a blown out window, and then also the exposure to deal with the true white with no detail, and then also the blacks to bring in contrast and make your photo pop and give it a little bit more life. So now that we kind of have, you know, a basic sort of tonality, I might want to, actually, I'll just do it with the shadows, and then I'll add more. So now that I boosted up the shadows a bit more, it's made it even more flat. So now I can go back and I'll add more blacks. There we go. So now we have this nicely exposed photo. And for this photo, I probably honestly would just go and pull up on the structure slider rather than going in and adding an HDR look or dynamic contrast. But since I didn't go over an HDR look before, we'll go in and do that. And a huge thing to keep in mind, especially if you're merging HDR photos together, is that most of the time they're either going to be too cold or too warm. For example, this photo, these kitchen lights in here are making all of this area pretty warm, but then the rest of this area is pretty cool. I think that this area is pretty true color to what it was like when I shot it, but this area is a little warm, and it's only happening to this side. So rather than going down to your temperature slider down here and kind of heating up or cooling the photo down, what I would do is I would go into your local adjustments here and grab, I would just reset it, and then go down to your temperature, make it kind of cooler, and then go to your local adjustments, gradient, drop that. Oops, is it this way? Oh, this way, there we go. And then you can kind of, what I usually like to do if I'm doing this is I'll look at the ceiling. So if you look while I'm scrolling across this on the ceiling, how this area is blending a lot better with this area. Whereas before, see that? So you kind of want to do something to that effect and just kind of get it. I mean, you can feather the crap out of it too. But just to sort of subdue a lot of those darker areas in there. And then you can even make it more so. And then you can pull down on the opacity. Probably about right there. There we go. So now we've kind of fixed that blue tint, or that rather the warm tint on the photo, and kind of made it so they all look, or made it so the whole scene looks like it's the same color. So now what I'd probably do is I'd go back, and now that everything's basically the same color, I would go back and now play with the temperature, because now everything in the scene is going to be basically the same color. So if you wanted to heat up the photo a little, maybe a little bit of warmth, just to bring some warmth into the area over there. So there we go. Now we have, sort of a basic tonality set for our shot. The next thing I probably want to do is crop this chair out. And this will be a good example of framing. So if we pull this crop in here, you'll see that if I pull it in a little too far, it crops out that chair. And it's a little too tight on the bulldog picture here. So you're going to want to pull it back a little bit just so it gives a little bit of breathing room. Like just a little bit of breathing room on this chair and then on this bulldog here. Because if I cropped it here, it'd look ugly. It wouldn't, it'd look off like something needed to be removed. So we'll go back and we'll go over till it's just, a little bit of breathing room. And we still have this area right here. So what we can do is we'll grab the magic eraser and we'll try to remove it the old-fashioned way. And you can just keep doing it. If it does it a little bit and it messes it up or it looks a little janky, just keep doing it. And it should do something to where at least it's less distracting and people will not notice. Or if it's like that and you fix it like that, now you can go into your crop and just, oops. There we go. Now we have that whole thing removed and we have a little bit of breathing room left. So if you can't do it with the magic eraser tool, just keep doing it to remove some of it, and then you can just go back and crop. So now we have our photo kind of nicely cropped. We have our leading lines leading into our subject area of the kitchen. We have marketable features such as this island here, the countertops. We have a fireplace that we can see over there, and then also windows. So basically in this scene, the only thing that we could probably, if we were being really picky, is we could probably lower the tripod just a little bit, just so it seems a little bit bigger. The tripod's pretty high up here. And the main thing about shooting with kitchens, as far as the tripod goes, is you don't want to see the bottom of cabinets. So if you're shooting a kitchen, obviously that one's kind of an exception to the rule because there should be a refrigerator there and you wouldn't see the bottom of that. But if they're incredibly low and you see like these lights and you see the bottom of the cabinets, it looks a little off. It's going to make your kitchen look big, but it's not going to look as well as it could be because you're kind of seeing the undercarriage of the cabinets and it doesn't look as clean as it could. So keep in mind that tripod height is a huge thing too, especially when you're shooting interiors. Okay, we'll go back to, now that we've done sort of more, actually, oh, that's my bad, guys. I was going to show you guys effects. Okay, so for this photo, since we didn't do HDR look on the last one, this would be a great one to use HDR look for because it's an HDR merged exposure. So if you merge your photos together in HDR, it's going to give them the HDR look filter automatically. I just kind of removed it just for purposes of showing you guys. So we'll just add a filter and we'll just add HDR look. And you'll notice right away that I turn this on and off. I mean, it just makes everything sharp, makes everything pop. It just gives it this nice HDR look, and it looks more like a really safe photo that you've seen. There's a few different preset options. If you're really going crazy, you can go down to surreal. I typically like to stick with natural just because it looks a little bit more natural. And then what I'll do is I'll go and I'll probably turn down the vibrance just a tad, just so that there's not a whole lot of super bright, incredibly bright colors. And then if you turn down this vibrance here, you can always add like a color enhancer filter or something to go back in, and then you can play with the vibrance how you'd please, and you could, mask on different areas. So that's what the HDR look filter looks like. I mean, you can tell right away that it brings the photo to life. It brings all this sharpness into every area, every nook and cranny. So another thing too is if you're shooting or you're using this HDR look filter and it's kind of crunching up areas that you don't want it to crunch up, You can always just paint it out. So just hit B on your keyboard and you have this paint out brush right here, and you can just simply, like these chairs right here, it looks a little too crunchy. So if I zoom in, you can see that the chairs just look a little crunchy and they're kind of distracting. So we'll just grab that brush and we'll just brush out those chairs. Zoom out. And then also in here, like this area of this kitchen looks kind of weird. This area over here. So it's, you know, the great thing about adding contrast and sharpness and detail inside of effects is that you can always go in and mask out all of the areas that you don't want those filters to be applied to. Whereas in develop, if you add structure, the only way to take that off is to reset it. So kind of depends on what your preference is, how fast you want to work. Obviously structure, you build up the slider and you're good to go. So kind of depends on the room too, all depending on, you know, how you shoot it, where you're at in the room, what you want, you know, what you want sharp. So all right, we'll go out of this HDR exposure and we'll go to an exterior. So this is another HDR exposure for an interior. And the thing about interiors is that most of the time, if you can get the light to hit the front of the house, that's ideal. But if you can't, I would recommend shooting in HDR because it allows you to really see the front of the house. If you do shoot, or if you end up shooting a house and the sun's behind the house and it's kind of peeking through, what I usually like to do is I'll just hold my finger up or hold my hand up to kind of block the rays of the sun. Because if you do have a sun right here, it's probably going to give your lens some, what am I thinking of? It's probably going to give you some lens flare on your lens, sorry. And then it's going to be incredibly distracting, and they're incredibly hard to remove because they're basically going to be the same color. You know, they're going to be a little bit brighter color than what's on there. They're going to look like raindrops on your lens. It's going to be terrible. So if you do end up shooting a house and the sun is behind the house, definitely recommend holding your finger up, trying to sort of block that out. You can always go back into post and remove it using the clone stamp tool or the magic eraser. So that's a great way to do it. If you do end up something like this where the sun's a little bit over there and it kind of hits the side of the house, that's much better than it hitting the back of the house. So always try to shoot a house with either the sun on the sides or the front, and try to avoid shooting it with the sun in the back. And if you do, just try to shoot HDR because it'll allow you to bring out those darker tones that are shadowed by the sun being in the back. So, okay, so we have this exterior shot here, and the first thing I'm going to do with exterior shots is you probably want to crop it, and I'll probably just use like a 4x5, and I'll just bring it down. And it's kind of just like any photo, you know, you want to have, you know, your foreground and then, you know, your subject, and then you have a nice background. So for this photo in particular, my tripod height was a little too low, I think. And the reason that's a little too low is because this grass area is kind of flat. There's not a whole lot. It's not like leading my eye into this area as well as I would want. Whereas if I had the tripod height a little bit higher, we could kind of see more of this foliage and the landscaping. And then this rock here would bring our eyes a lot more into the subject, our house. But it's not too bad. Obviously, it gets the job done. And the main thing about cropping exterior shots is you want to have the house not in the center of the frame, but a little bit. I try to keep at least like 2/3 of the house above this rule of thirds line, just so it's not, because if you kept the house right in the center of the frame, it looks a little wonky. So you could pull it down probably about right there. So like maybe 2/3 of the house is above this rule of thirds line, and then just crop it. And it looks incredible. It looks, you know, a lot better like that than it did with the whole entire scene. So what we can do now is we'll make sure our lines are straight, which in this case, you're not looking at your vertical lines, you're looking at your horizontal lines, because you're going to be tilting your camera back whenever you're shooting the real estate photos. You're not going to be keeping the camera level. If you do keep the camera level, or if you do decide that you want to keep the camera level, you're going to have to you know, raise your tripod up, or I used to put my tripod on the hood of my car or on the top of my car. It does look a lot better when everything is level, but I get that, you know, on these busy streets and stuff, you can't always do that. So tilting the camera, no big deal. Just tilt the camera a little bit back. So you kind of have this in frame, but then also you have like a foreground sort of area that can kind of lead the viewer's eye into your house. I wouldn't tilt up incredibly high so that that's all you see is just that. I would give your viewers some sort of sense of the landscaping and the lay of the land around the house. So that's a good way to do it if you're shooting outdoor. If you can keep the camera level, keep it level. You could stand on maybe the other edge of the street with like a zoom lens or something, and shoot it from further away. But if you don't have anything like that, like I said, tilting the camera back is no big deal. And so we'll kind of do the same thing we did before. It's a little different with exterior photos whenever you're editing, because you're probably not going to have a bunch of blown out windows like you would in the interior of a home. It's a little bit easier to edit. It's kind of just like editing a landscape photo. First thing I'd probably like to do is just hold down my J key, see all of the true white and true black clipping warnings. These true white warnings, probably not a huge deal because obviously we're shooting at clouds and people get the clouds are white. If you are a stickler about it, just simply pull back on the exposure, remove any of that true white, and like we did before, just pull up on the shadows. And you'll notice right away that when I pull up on the shadows, it makes the front of the house look incredibly flat. So just go back and pull back on the black slider. Actually, sorry. Put it right there. And then what we'll do is we'll head back up to our midtones here. Sorry. The midtones are a great way to bring out the mid-range tones in your photo, and with exteriors especially, because a lot of these houses have mid-tone colors on them, this is kind of the slider you're going to be wanting to deal with. So you'll see that if I pull that back or pull it up, it kind of gives it that right amount of, it kind of deals with the perfect tones for us. So I'd probably pull that back a little bit and then maybe just pull back up on the exposure. And so we didn't really need to do a whole lot to this photo. We kind of just needed to bring in a little bit of contrast, a little bit of that darker, a little bit of those darker areas. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm probably going to cool the photo down just a tad. Because if I go back, you notice it's pretty warm in here. So I'll cool it down quite a bit. Probably about 18. So now that we have the color and we've kind of set the tonality for our exterior shot, now a great thing to do is probably use some local adjustments to kind of tone down this area on the foreground so that we kind of have this as our subject. So what I would do is kind of what we did before earlier with the color, but rather we're just going to do this with exposure now. And we're going to add a new local adjustment layer. And this is a great way, especially if you do have a shot like this where you have this incredibly bright green grass. And it's all great. I love seeing landscaping on the front of a house, but for this photo in particular, since I didn't have my tripod incredibly high, or my camera was tilted back, we don't really see a whole lot of this landscape, and it's kind of a little bit distracting. So what we can do is just grab our local adjustment gradient again, drop it down, we'll turn it around, and we'll turn that on and off. And you'll see it's kind of coming up on our house here, so we can just pull it down to about there. And you'll see already that helps. It helps kind of subdue this area down here. And if you really wanted to be a stiffler about it, you could probably crop those rocks. I like having the rocks just because it kind of adds to the framing of it. But I could see if you didn't want the rocks in there. But just having that local adjustment layer really kind of takes a lot of that heat out of the driveway and a lot of the warmth out of this grass, and kind of makes it a little less distracting. So another good thing, if you are using local adjustment layers, and say you leave this exposure a little bit higher and you kind of have these blown out areas in your sky, you can always use like a local adjustment layer, add another one, darken, and you could paint whatever, if you wanted to go in there, and then you could just pull back on the opacity. I probably would remove that one. But as far as this one goes, be pretty easy to remove those. Okay, so now that we have, we have this local adjustment layer applied, and we have sort of that area on the bottom a little bit subdued. The next thing I would do is I would head into effects, and I would add in some detail into the front of this house. And you could either do that by using dynamic contrast, or like we did earlier with HDR look. You could also go in and add a tone enhancer, and you could use the clarity slider down here. What I would recommend is probably using HDR look. You'll see right away that once I added that, I mean, it just made everything sharp. It brought out all of those, the high dynamic range of the tones, and you can really see what's going on in the photo a lot better, especially in the house here. So you could even do surreal maybe, and that doesn't even look like that bad. What I'm going to do is I'm probably going to leave our natural on, but then I'm going to go up to the masking options, and I'm going to invert it, and then I'm just going to paint it onto the house rather than having it on these clouds, because you'll see that if I don't, it kind of accentuates this really blown out area up here. And we can go back and we'll just pull back on those. Maybe a little bit more shadows. So there we go. Now that's inverted. Now what we can do is we'll grab our masking brush, Shift X, and we'll just paint on this HDR look onto our house. And it's a little bit dark. You'll notice that when I'm painting it on there, it's coming on a little bit dark. But no worries, you can always head down to the tonality of the HDR look, and you can just simply pull up on the shadows. And you'll see that, pulling it up and down, you can kind of tell what you're dealing with. Probably pull up on the shadows just a little bit. Right there. There we go. So now that we have, now we have that HDR look applied, and it's only applied to the house so that the clouds aren't crunchy, and this areas over here, don't have a bunch of HDR look on them when they don't need it. So you'll notice that by, editing an exterior is a lot easier than editing an interior. And I think that all has to do with the fact that there's probably going to be blown out windows whenever you're shooting interiors. So we'll close out of this, and we'll go into sorry. Sorry guys, I'm just gonna check real quick and see if I have any questions here. So no questions. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to hit up that Q&A and I'll try to get to them. Okay, so we're kind of finishing up here. I'm probably just gonna go over merging this exterior photo from a drone, and then kind of how to edit it using an HDR, and then we'll go over a few different gear recommendations that I would recommend, and then we should be good to go, guys. So I have these three auto exposure brackets that I shot with my drone. And if you haven't shot with a drone, they're incredibly helpful for real estate, especially if you're shooting somewhere with large acreage of land, or somewhere out in the country. They really kind of give you a sense of scale. They give you a sense of where everything's located. For this particular photo, I just wanted to kind of show you guys how to put together a photo in HDR. I know we weren't going to really go over that, but it's probably a good topic to get into, especially if you are shooting real estate. So if you want to merge your photos together if you want to merge your photos together into an HDR photo, simply select them and then go into HDR. And it'll instantly merge your photos together. What you're seeing here in the HDR dialog is we have our three auto exposure brackets. It's telling us the exposure for them, and this is -7 under the actual correct exposure, and this is 0.7 over. So it's almost a stop over and then almost a stop below. You'll notice that you can choose any of these auto exposure brackets. You can remove them. What I'm going to do is actually, you'll see that you have this aperture symbol here, and I'm actually going to select this one, which it'll brighten the photo up a bit because it's actually using this photo as our base exposure. Whereas if I use this photo as the base exposure, it's going to darken the photo. So we'll use this as our base exposure, and you'll notice that once I select it, it makes that the base exposure by putting it at 0, 0 exposure. Whereas these are, that's almost a stop under, and then, almost a stop and a half under. So we have our auto exposure brackets merged. It's already added our HDR look onto there. It's added the natural look, but we can add surreal if we want. We can add, whatever. Any of these options are going to be re-editable once you save this, so you can always go back and re-edit them. I wouldn't worry too much about getting the look right in here, since it is a smaller dialogue, and you can always go back, and re-edit the photos. So we'll go into tone and color, and I'll probably just pull up on the exposure a little, the contrast, the midtones, shadows, and then pull back on the blacks. And then for this photo, I'm just going to pull up on the structure. Probably doesn't need much, but I'm just going to give it a little bit more structure so it's a little bit more sharp. And then we'll just pull back on the temperature just to warm it up a little. And now we'll save it. So it's going to merge our photos together, and it's going to open this photo up inside of Develop because we chose that as our open in option. And once it merges the photo together, there we go. So we have this nicely merged exposure, and we can start editing it. The great thing about shooting with HDR, especially if you're shooting real estate exteriors, is that you're not going to have to do a whole lot to them. Probably the only thing I would do to this is maybe go in and possibly add a sunshine filter. And the reason I like to add sunshine filters is because it kind of gives it a little bit of life. It gives it a little bit of oomph. And keep in mind that if you are adding the sunshine filter, it's going to probably brighten up the warmer colors in your shot. So you can always go down to this warmth control and just pull back how you please, probably about -15. You'll see it, it does a nice job of sort of brightening everything up and emulating a nice sunshine look. Next thing I would do is I'd probably crop a little. Again, you probably don't want the entire house in the center of the frame. And also, I do kind of like this road that kind of leads around here. So we'll just crop it like that. And there we go. Now we have this nice road that kind of leads around. Our eyes are kind of brought into this house here. The next filter I'd probably add onto this, if I'm being kind of picky, is I'd probably add a tone enhancer. And then I would add, or go down to curves. And I usually like to do this if the photo's looking a little dull. So if your photo's looking a little dull, you need something added to it. You can pull up on this black point here, pull back on your shadows, and then pull up on your midtones. And it kind of just brings like a nice look to your shot. This is looking a little too contrasty, but if you do end up shooting real estate and you're like, I need to add a filter on it, I need to do something better to this, I just need to liven it up. Tone enhancer, pull up on the black point, pull down on the shadows a little, and then just boost your midtones a little. And it'll give your photo a nice sort of boost. A good filter for this might be honestly the vignette. That kind of subdues all of those areas around our house here. And then we can use this centering tool to kind of make sure that the vignette's in the center. And then what we can do is just play with the size of it. There we go. If I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll notice that we have a nicely edited HDR exposure of a house here. So that's kind of all I have as far as the editing side of things go and composition-wise. So the next thing I was going to show you guys is a couple gear recommendations that I would recommend if you're kind of starting out and shooting real estate. This is the lens that I use whenever I'm shooting real estate. I like it because it's $300 and the picture quality is pretty great. It's really light, pretty easy to pack around, and it's just kind of an all-around great lens. It's very affordable. The next thing I would recommend is probably having a ball head tripod. So the next thing I would recommend is probably having a ball head tripod. Oops. Hopefully you guys are seeing this. If you guys aren't seeing this, hit up the Q&A and tell me. Anyway, so I'll go back here if you guys didn't see this. So this is the lens that I use, is this 10 to 18 millimeter. And then as far as ball head tripods, there's a ton of different good ones out there. They're great. Okay, you see it, Mo. Okay, so the newer one, I would recommend this one just because it's 52 bucks, and I'm a huge review guy, and so this is the one I bought, and I've had it for like a year and a half, and I wouldn't recommend it shooting, you know, like landscapes or something that you really need your camera is incredibly as steady as possible. But if you're just looking to get into shooting some real estate and, you know, you want like a cheap tripod, this is probably a good one to go to. Probably anything under $100. I used to have this Dolica one. You can tell by the reviews, there's almost 3,000 of them. So you honestly don't have to spend you know, a whole paycheck just to get a bunch of gear to shoot real estate. And you can make a lot of money having, you know, the bottom line gear. I had a really terrible tripod when I first started, and just that lens, and this is the camera. I have the 70D, and it worked out fine. I didn't need anything else. And then I started getting into, you know, buying other things, and I realized, you know, polarizing filters were great for shooting at blown out windows. And then I realized that I wanted to keep my camera level all the time. So I shot with this hot shoe level, which this thing has saved my life on more than one occasion because it allows you to keep your camera level without actually looking into the viewfinder or looking at the live view mode. So this thing just basically sits on your hot shoe, and then you can just tilt it around and it'll level your camera for you. And it's like $9. So it's a great investment. It'll help you out, especially if you're trying to keep your vertical straight. Polarizing filters, obviously, kind of depends on what your lens is because they're going to be different sizes, but Amazon Basics does a pretty good one. It gets the job done. It's obviously not like a Tiffin or one of those high-end ones, but for 10 bucks, it's going to get the job done, and you're probably going to be pretty satisfied with the results. And then, yeah, so I was showing you guys earlier, this is probably what I would recommend as far as going in and getting your first camera body. I really like the 70D simply because it has Wi-Fi, it has touchscreen, it shoots great, shoots raw, and yeah, it's just an all-around great beginner camera. I think you can get a body for like $5, definitely less than $6. So, well, that's basically all I have for you guys as far as shooting real estate. We went over a little bit on how to compose your photo. Keep in mind that you kind of want to keep in, we'll go back here to some of these shots. Keep in mind that you want to keep, you know, your leading lines in your frame, and that you want to have a third wall. You want to pay attention to whenever you're framing and you're cropping so that you don't remove something halfway in there and it looks a little distracting. If you do decide to shoot symmetrical, make sure that everything is symmetrical. Make sure that you're right in the middle of the frame. Make sure that your verticals are straight. If you are shooting with using or merging HDR exposures together, keep in mind that your windows are probably not going to be as blown out, so I wouldn't worry too much about using the exposure sliders or things like that. Use structure as you please, but you can always add in details and stuff with dynamic contrast and the HDR look filter. So yeah, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. We have more webinars coming up, so stay tuned for those. And yeah, thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day.